evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The rivalry between the US and China continues to reshape the global economy, from the reconfiguration of global supply chains to the strategic competition for influence in Southeast Asia. So the question is, how should this region navigate the increasingly fragmented world order? So joining me on the show today are two speakers from the Asia-Pacific Roundtable, which is organized by ISIS Malaysia and ASEAN-ISIS. Elina Noor is a Senior Fellow of the Asia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in the US, and Professor Danny Quah, Dr. Danny Quah, who is a Ka Shing Professor in Economics and also the Dean of the Kuan School of Public Policy in NUS. Welcome to the show, both of you. It's good to have you in person here with me.
Thank you for having us.
And I think you both are well placed, well situated to talk about what we often say as how the US and China reshaping or redefining this multipolar era. But how would each of you characterize that? I mean, what's your assessment of where things currently stand? If I may begin with you, Elina.
So I think, sitting where I am now, having just returned to the region from being in the US for a long time, we are in, some would say unprecedented times, but I would actually push back against that. I think these ruptures that we see in the United States have always been there. They've been latent. Perhaps we haven't paid as much attention to them as we should have. And these ruptures are now coming to the fore with a lot of unpredictability in the political space that are spilling over into the economic realm, and that's causing a bit of chaos for the whole world. Danny would know a lot more about that on the tariff front, but it makes trying to predict policies in Southeast Asia a lot more challenging just because of this unpredictability, because US policies obviously affect us in the region, and in terms of planning, it's a little bit of a challenge when you're trying to plan, you know, even a month down the line. Policies in the US could change in the next hour.
Was it different before? Were we more able to anticipate policies or the trajectory of the US previously?
We saw a preview of this under the first Trump administration, so it's not completely new to us, but then I think we got used to going back to the normal way of doing business in Washington under Joe Biden's administration. And now some would say it's even more intense under the second Trump administration, this unpredictability and capriciousness. But yeah, we can talk about some of these latent ruptures that I mentioned earlier, but I think those fault lines have always been there on the domestic political front in the US.
What about you, Danny? Do you agree that this is a moment of intensification?
It is, certainly. I have spent a lot of time also traveling to Washington, D.C. and Beijing alternately, try and understand what the thinking is. And I might, if I may, say that the way you've described this, Melisa, is a very good way, US-China rivalry. But also saying that hides a little bit some of the underlying dynamics. Let me say what I mean by that. Coca-Cola and Pepsi are rivals. They're not thinking about going to war against each other. They're not involving other nations or other companies swirling about in a gigantic chessboard of geopolitics. So there's rivalry, but then there's something deeper. And you know, there's a sense in which we might ask, if there's a rivalry, what is each of them trying to achieve?
Danny, you've anticipated my next question.
Okay.
I was really a kind of a zooming out, really to understand what it is that each superpower wants and what each superpower is trying to do.
Perhaps before we get to that, I do want to address that question. But I think there's at least the following ways of thinking about the rivalry. One is that it's John F. Kennedy in the 1960s got out on the steps of Capitol Hill and described the Cold War as the final twilight struggle of humanity between the forces of democracy and freedom and totalitarianism and tyranny. And every now and then you do hear an American politician say that. There's also a different sense in which America is having to deal with the economics of the rise of China, what sometimes people call the China shock. So is the China shock, is China stealing American jobs? Is it dismantling American industry? Is it turning into ghost towns what were once thriving middle-class American communities? Now, either of these, the John F. Kennedy democracy is the fate of the world reason, or the China shock reason, drives it to a level above Coca-Cola and Pepsi.
Okay.
So we're beginning to get somewhere now. But I worry that there's a third factor here, which is a line of thinking that says that America will not tolerate the rise of an alternative, powerful hegemon. Another nation that's powerful enough that can dictate terms of engagement wherever that other nation is. Now, this is a way of thinking that then says America needs to contain that. It needs to prevent the rise of this other hegemon, because that other hegemon's continued ascendance will, in the near future, sharply constrain America's prospects and freedom of actions. That would be a reason for going to war, for engaging in the kind of conflict that we're beginning to see emerge. So while rivalry captures that, it also does not reveal this triumvirate of different reasons. And I think thinking about those reasons is maybe a one way to proceed.
How would you then characterize it, if not the term rivalry?
Geostrategic competition.
There you go.
Hegemonic power, the chase for hegemony.
I do have to ask you, does China want to be the next power hegemon?
I think...
or is this America projecting it on them?
I think there's part of it is America's projecting. I think that we can document that. Yeah. Part of it is the belief that this is inadvertent. It doesn't matter
if they want
what China wants. And in fact, in some of that thinking, it doesn't matter that China's political ideology is different from America's. So it's completely different from, say, the way John F. Kennedy thought about this. In this other thinking, that the question is who gets to be hegemon, it actually doesn't matter if the alternative is a democracy, is an economic rival in the sense of producing the same things that were chasing technology. It's simply the mere fact that there's this other source of power out there that could be a challenge. And it doesn't matter what they intend.
Right.
So that's a rather dim view of the world. I've given you 3 different ways to think about this rivalry. Yeah. And I think that those 3 help us. Each of those has something to say about this. Yeah. And all of them make for a situation in the world more dangerous than just rivalry between Coca-Cola and Pepsi.
It is a very almost, it doesn't capture the depth and the urgency. Yeah. Elina, what do you think? Does it not matter what China wants to achieve? And could you also add another layer in terms of the tech competition and the US's efforts to have this tech containment of China?
Yeah, so when Danny was talking, all I could think about was this alternate reality of the pursuit of happiness being the pursuit of hegemony.
Yeah.
But it goes to your question, Melisa, and both your questions tie into each other, because the tech piece plays a significant role in this pursuit of hegemony, or the maintenance, the preservation of hegemony on the American side at least. And I agree with Danny, it doesn't matter what China wants. China has articulated that it's not interested in global hegemony, not even regional hegemony. If it is going to be this leader of the region, Beijing has said we're going to be a very different sort of leader than the US has. Now, some would argue that that will actually be the case. But I think from the US side, it is the maintenance of that dominance that fuels a lot of what we see today, including this pursuit of tech preeminence at all costs, right? And so you see the strangulation of Chinese access to advanced chips, to increasingly all sorts of other things throughout the global value chain that includes third countries such as ours in Southeast Asia. And if we cast our minds back to imperial times, it was technology that drove a lot of imperial progress and ultimately capture of the world. And today is no different. We're just seeing it through digital lens.
Okay, so how do we then respond to this? I mean, if this is the new normal that we have to get used to, the fact that there is chronic uncertainty in the global order, for countries, in between, as giants jostle for influence, where does that leave us in this region? Danny?
Well, I can take a stab at
Sure.
that. Where that leaves us and what we must do has got to depend on what we think they're trying to achieve. So this is one of your earlier parts of our earlier discussion. There's a view that I subscribe to, that regardless of what China or America want, the fact that they're so large and so powerful means that we will always need to be a little bit wary of them, even if they are great friends. And the image that I have in mind is that we're all trying to drink at a water hole. And then we've got an elephant coming.
It's the Serengeti here.
Yeah, the Serengeti. So the elephant comes in, and the elephant does not intend any of us harm. But by virtue of its size, it steps on us, it tramples on us, and it doesn't even notice. It drinks its fill, and it turns around, and it takes out half the population sitting around the waterhole, and it doesn't even notice because it's so monumentally consequential. So I think that's one way to think about what's going on here.
Is it
And
China or
Oh,
the US who's
I
intentionally left it vague?
intentionally avoided naming names.
Very ambiguous.
But if we try and get down to China and the United States, which is a question that you had pushed my direction earlier, taking into account the fact that there is this large-size consequentiality effect, I think one can make the argument and document that China is still concerned about generating prosperity for its people. Right? Half of China remains very poor. It wants to be in a position where it can say, I have delivered to you, the people, economic prosperity and stability. The problem is that the way it's trying to do that has led to America feeling very insecure economically. So we've got two elephants, one of which wants to do good for its people, the other of which thinks that by China trying to do good for its people, it threatens America. Now this is separate from the other possibilities, but this is one potential way to think about what they intend. What should we do as a result of this? I think both taking into account the elephant analogy and this other story, I think we need to accept that the world is going to be characterized by this kind of geopolitical competition. Right? We have to accept that, and we are going to be, it's going to make us all feel awkward, whether it's certain or uncertain, just because of the consequentiality of their size. We need to think about how we protect ourselves, but we also need to think about how we can help. We can help America feel less insecure. We can help convince China that even if it were less, even if it were less so fiercely competitive with sharp elbows, its people would still prosper. We can try and bring about a reconciliation while keeping the goals of these two giants, and that creates space for us. And we can try and build mechanisms to do that. So I think we have lots of agency, even in this world of great geopolitical competition.
Without choosing sides, is that
Without
what you're saying?
choosing sides.
Okay, so
I think it's absolutely essential we do not choose sides. The choosing sides narrative is an idea that you can think about carving up our planet into spheres of influence that don't overlap. So you have to be in one or the other. But the reality is, the world is not just spheres of influence. Even in just the story that I just said, help America feel more secure. Help make it feel that its people can continue to be taken care of. Make China feel that there's room for its people to enjoy greater prosperity. There's no taking sides there. We've lifted everybody together. That's the goal that I think the rest of us should aim for.
Elina.
Yes, well, I think this is the aspiration that many of us aim towards. But I think there are some in the United States, including in Washington, that do see the world as spheres of influence. So we do have to deal with these two different sets of reality. And in that sense, there is a choice. Do we go along with that carving up of the space? And we see this in the fragmentation of the tech space, for example. I just gave you the example of how third countries are being affected by some of the policy decisions in Washington in terms of denying China access to chips and other components. Now, I do think that we need to be good friends to both, but I think we also need more friends elsewhere. And I feel this builds on Danny's point of agency, where we not only look to the traditional poles of friendships we've always looked towards, whether it's in Washington, in Beijing, in Brussels, or elsewhere, but we do need to look to the other regions that are facing similar challenges to us, such as in Africa, such as in Latin America. And those, I feel, have been underlooked in terms of where we can draw lessons from, because there are converging challenges all these different regions in the global majority are facing, but we haven't really communicated about the lessons and the good practices that we can exchange.
What do you think is hindering more cooperation or from us talking to each other? And I think about the fact that Asia accounts for half of the global GDP, but do you see a situation, and how might we get to the point where the geopolitical weight of the region is eventually matches its economic power or rising economic power?
One of the challenges in us in Southeast Asia not talking more to our counterparts in either Latin America or Africa is the simple tyranny of distance. But also there's a language barrier with certain countries, Spanish-speaking countries, French-speaking countries. That said, we're all in the age of translation apps now, so that shouldn't be too much of a barrier anymore. But I also feel that in Southeast Asia, we perhaps have been too familiar with talking to just certain sets of friends. And we need to break outside that mindset and think about the world in much larger terms.
Yeah. Danny?
If I may add to what Elina said, I think that there are two important ideas that I want to advance on and build on this. One is that as we gather friends around the world, we should be very careful, scrupulous in not ever giving the suggestion that we think we're gathering enough friends so that we have enough power, so we have enough political weight to counter the giants. The last thing we want to do is to stand across a battlefield from a great power, simply thinking we've amassed enough people with us. I think that would be the wrong thing. I know that's not what you're suggesting, but I'm saying that as we look for friends, what we really want to be looking for is space to allow everyone to cooperate. That gets me to my second idea.
Yes.
Who's intent on cooperating these days? The world is not about to, sort of explode in an orgy of cooperation. Nobody is agreeing with anybody else. Everybody is disagreeing with everybody else.
We're agreeing.
Yeah, well, aside from us in this room. But let me suggest that one of the ideas that I think we might want to develop is the idea of inadvertent cooperation. Inadvertent cooperation. That is, getting people to do the right thing in a cooperative way, even when they disagree. Getting people to do the right thing, even for the wrong reason. So we somehow need to think about ways in which nimble nations like ours, that are smaller, that don't want to be in a threatening kind of position, but we can provide the nudges that help move actions by countries into a cooperative position.
Give me an example.
Okay, so I'll give you an example. Electric vehicles. Right. So I begin with the idea that electric vehicles, I mean, there's lots of things that we can unpack about how they come into being, but once they're there, they're a good way for humanity to control its destiny without burning our planet to a crisp. Right? Because usual things that we do totally destroy the planet. The world needs more EVs. But we've got a problem because China makes EVs America and Western and European Union say China makes EVs so well only because the government subsidizes this. Let's put aside whatever the reality. The actions in this wave of disagreement that America and the European Union have taken is we're going to tariff and sanction China. Sorry. While we do that, we will build our own EV industry. So there's competition. There's the idea that the Chinese are playing unfair. We're going to get them for this. The end result of this is that we will, at some point, have competitive EV industries. But in the meantime, our global production of EVs will have fallen. The global south, which needs new forms of energy, does not have access to EVs now. That's one possibility. They're doing all these things for the reason that they want to advance themselves. Let me suggest a different way in which they can advance themselves, but with a very different outcome. Instead of America and EU tariffing and sanctioning China, supposed to say, you're playing unfair. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. I will also play unfair. I will also subsidize my EV industry. Now, think about what that happens. China then says, oh, well, you're playing unfair, but you go ahead and do what you do. Right. The end result of all this is a wave of fleets of EVs rolling out of China, America, and the EU, ready, because they're high quality, lower price, for the global south to use. They've done the right thing for the wrong reason.
Okay, I see.
They have inadvertently cooperated. And I think nimble nations like ours that do not want to be in the front lines of international violent confrontation, we should be coming up with schemes for inadvertent cooperation, like the kind that I just described.
Okay, well, we've spent a lot of time anticipating what the US and what China wants. And I understand that because they are superpowers, we need to be wary of the elephant at the drinking pond, if I may use your analogy. But what is it that the US and China doesn't understand or understands about a changing Southeast Asia or changing Asia? Are they taking the time and care to anticipate what Asia wants and how Asia is growing? If I may ask you, Elina, that question.
That's a really good question, and I don't know if Washington has taken the time to even think in those terms, because as my boss says, the US and China are strategic narcissists. Then they only think about themselves and they see themselves as the center of the world. And I think that question should be directed to us in Southeast Asia, actually. How do we want to project ourselves to either Beijing or Washington? And it may be that we project ourselves differently to these two capitals because these two capitals have different desires of us, but we need to be confident in what we want out of our relationships with them. Right. And to be honest, I think this is going to depend on issues. It's going to depend on sectors, whether it's EVs or AI governance, for example. But we need to work this out amongst ourselves first and foremost.
So we should set the narrative and the projection that we want.
Absolutely.
I agree with Elina, we should. But I also, okay, look, as you know, I'm an economist. I have a very dim view of humanity. The fact that Beijing and Washington are narcissists is totally fine with me, because I think most people are like that. The question is, what's the consequence of their thinking? America's thinking today is very different from America's thinking 15, 20 years ago, for the last 70 years. Today, America's thinking, following the narcissism line, is that it feels the world has done it wrong. And the world has ripped off America. This is the Trump Make America Great Again line. We need to take back what the world has taken from us. So in that view, whether you are NATO in Western Europe or whether you're Southeast Asia, you've done something wrong. Liberation Day tariffs were an evidence of that. Obviously, Trump and his people believed that the entire world had done them wrong. They slapped tariffs on everybody, including my good friends in the Heard Island and McDonald Islands, 2,000 penguin economists. they too have been hit by terrorists. So America feels aggrieved. If it's going to do that to the Herd Island, McDonald Island, think about what it will do to successful economies like ours if it feels that it is aggrieved. Yeah. So we need to take that into account. China, on the other hand, is also a narcissist. We got to watch out for its sharp elbows in its foreign policy, but at least it continues to talk the talk of multilateralism, globalization, win-win outcomes. Now, there's lots to unpack there. Narcissists will say that even if they don't believe that, because that's what they do. But put that to one side. This is how we're going to need to manage what happens here. We don't want to be in the competition where we come up and say, we are another great power, and we are as narcissistic as you. Let's see whose narcissism wins out. We don't want to do that. What we want to do is say, we want to be helpful, and at the same time, we help ourselves. And it is possible to do that using ideas of like inadvertent cooperation, or even that we can just build our own multilateral system. If America doesn't want to be part of our world, there's no amount of arguing that can bring it back. So we need to build our own. Right. We note it, we rewire our world, and we carry on. And that's not the best outcome, neither is it a terrible outcome. What we can do is continue to make America and China truly understand that we want them to be part of our world.
It's a good enough outcome.
It's a good enough.
It's a good enough
outcome.
It's not
a good outcome,
it is.
It's a good enough outcome.
Exactly.
Yes.
It's a good enough outcome.
Both of you, I could talk to the both of you for hours. Thank you so much for being on the show today. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. This has turned out to be a therapy session.
Thank you for having us. It's always such a pleasure to see you.
That's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.